going on, everybody? Teddy Baldassarre here. Now, I was looking back at videos this year just that I posted, and I was pretty surprised to see that there's only been one video that I've posted all year that was covering Rolex. And I've had Rolex fatigue. I think a lot of people have Rolex fatigue, and I needed to take a little bit of a break. But I wanted to revisit the brand a little bit, not look at the more popular models or not even the recent releases that we saw unveiled, but instead a couple models that I think are probably underappreciated when looking at the world of sports Rolex. One being a Rolex Milgauss with the 116400GV, then also with the Rolex Yacht-Master reference 16622. So in this video, we're gonna take a closer look at both of the lines, also just kind of how these references came to be, and then ultimately kind of share some insight into how maybe they became a little underappreciated and why they should at least be on your radar if you are, say, the right person to purchase these watches. But guys, let's jump into it. All right, guys, now before we jump into this video, a couple cool buying guides and blogs I just released on the website. One being a tool watch blog, which I think is kind of relevant to what we're covering today. I don't think I can necessarily call the Milgauss a tool watch just given its price range, but in a lot of ways you can. I think it just kind of depends on what your thoughts are on about a tool watch in terms of pricing. I think that's sometimes a contested issue, but in that blog, really go over a variety of different price ranges. Could be a good reference point, as well as, say, somebody that might not have the budget, they're kind of just starting off, also have a range of watches under $500, automatic watches to take a look at. Over 40 watches mentioned there. And while you're over there, definitely check out the straps, the watches, full authorized dealer of all the brands that we're carrying. Gonna be adding a lot more brands in the next few months, so definitely stay tuned as well. So we all know the typical candidates when it comes to Rolex watches, and I feel despite the growing uncertainty of the world that we live in, one of the most constants that have kind of just persisted is the relative demand for Rolex, which is really still quite strong, and I was honestly pretty surprised because I thought we'd see more of a dip than we actually did. But the models that we have here today, I think, are two great examples of timepieces that are not maybe seen as collectible or as in demand at insane premiums, I should say. But I think that is one of the leading aspects of their appeal and why I really just wanted to cover them. You get the perks of a Rolex watch and its reliable, robust kind of nature without the same level of recognizable status, which in some areas might be a downside, but for the right type of consumer, I think for myself, that's something that I think is an added benefit, because I think sometimes the flash of Rolex gets in the way of the actual product that's taking place there, and you certainly feel that with the pricing. Now, the Rolex Milgauss is a range of watches that, like many models from Rolex, was developed as a tool to start and then took on looks that began to quickly deviate from that original plot. And although you can still feel a bit of separation from the original Milgauss here, I don't think it's been completely reworked from the ground up or completely shifted in terms of its overall focus compared to other models in the sports Rolex range. Now, the origins of the Milgauss is a bit contested in terms of like the first year it was unveiled, but it usually is widely agreed that in terms of being introduced with adequate levels of production, it was 1956 with that really first step onto the scene. The Milgauss was a timepiece developed for engineers, scientists, and other specialists that worked in conditions where their watches were exposed to magnetic fields. During this period, IWC released their Ingenuer in 1954, which certainly set the stage for others in this category, including the Omega Railmaster in 1957 that would shortly follow here. Yet it was during this period the standard in the defense against magnetism in watches was really increasing, and the Milgauss was certainly one of the leaders in this area in setting that standard. A standard that was incorporated with its name, Milgauss, with the mil referring to 1,000 and the Gauss referring to a unit of measurement for magnetic induction. The original references were very much a product that shared perhaps more similarities to the Submariner in looks than, say, a modern day Milgauss, given its inclusion of a rotating bezel, but a design trait that would become synonymous with the line that we also saw included here was a lightning bolt second hand. It wasn't until the creation of the reference 1019 where many of the modern ideas in terms of the case design were introduced. This model had a long run in production, with development being halted by the discontinuation of the Milgauss line in 1988. We then would have to jump ahead to the year 2007 until the Rolex Milgauss was put back into the spotlight with the release of the reference 116400, which perhaps the most striking of the models presented being that 116400GV. Now, the Milgauss, unlike many Rolex watches out there, offers a pretty independent experience of the brand without much overlap with other other models. The case comes in an oyster-style format at 40 millimeters, a lug-to-lug of 49 millimeters, and a thickness of 13 millimeters. The watch wears very similar to that of, say, a bulkier Explorer 39 millimeter 214-270, but still wears well from a mass market perspective. With its high-polished bezel and center link, it offers just the proper amount of flash while kind of working with the original ethos behind this line. But where this piece really made a splash during its release was when it offered something a bit different and distinct from previous Milgauss references, and that was the inclusion of a green tinted sapphire crystal, which is hinted at with the GV here at the end of the reference name, referring to glace vert. This glass crystal was the first time Rolex ever executed a shaded crystal like this, and for a company who often prides itself in its consistency and lack of change, I think this was a pretty interesting move by the brand. Within the dial, the 116400GV also offers a bit of new experiences as well with the matte dial surface instead of the typical popular glossy lacquer. It has pops of orange along the minute track and tinted lume markers coming in orange at each of the quarter hour markings. And of course, the orange lightning second hand paying tribute to the early days of the Milgauss design with a bit of modern flair. In addition, the watch offers resistance to magnetic fields up to 1000 Gauss with help of a soft iron cage set within the case protecting the Rolex automatic caliber 3131, as well as getting added support from a Paracom hairspring and resistance to shock with its free sprung balance, while also being a COSC certified chronometer with a power reserve of 48 to 50 hours approximately. But I think ultimately why this Milgauss reference I think is an interesting piece to look at, this one specifically, is it has a couple firsts, of course, one with that green tinted bezel. It has that interesting design. It was kind of that more entry point into that modern interpretation of the Milgauss. And in terms of where it's falling in price, looking at the other references, typically this is the one that's more readily available, but also at a cheaper price. I see these trading very often around that $7,000 to $8,000 range, which is not cheap, but getting into a kind of unique sports Rolex, I mean, that's kind of an interesting price nowadays when you're looking at the grand scheme of things. And I think this is one of the more underrated watches in terms of where it falls. And it's not gonna be a watch for everybody, but it also, for the right type of person, I think could be very appealing. And the fact that it doesn't look like a Rolex, it's different. Rolex is so mass market now that when looking at a watch like this, I think that is ultimately something that's gonna allow it to be different. And when looking at Rolex, often you're not getting that idea of being different. And in terms of its actual case construction and what you're getting across the board with the bracelet, sure, it's not completely modern, but you are getting, I think for the most part, pretty modern construction across the board. You're getting the Easy Link there, getting some micro adjustment in the clasp that you can use with the tool, but also getting some really solid links with this bracelet and being very comfortable, as well as just the overall case construction, the wearability, it's all there. The watch, again, is not gonna be for everybody, but I think that's part of its overall appeal. Now, Rolex has always kind of been that mass market brand for decades and decades, but in the last 20 years especially, I think we've seen a consistent kind of flow up market across all their entire catalog. And it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly when this happened. I think a lot of it can be attributed back to the maxi case style, as well as the ceramic bezels that were unveiled on many of their sports watches. I think that's kind of when things went from tool watch into a little bit more flash in a lot of ways, and things started to go a little bit up market. But another point, and I think it really brings forth this other reference here, was the actual Yacht-Master introduction in 1992. Much of what this watch was trying to do was kind of be that complementary piece to the Submariner, being a little bit more upscale, a little bit more daring, without having to, say, one-up the Submariner and allow it to be successful at what it's doing. But I think this was maybe even the early kind of progression into this world and kind of where Rolex ultimately wanted to go. They didn't necessarily catch this until later on, but I think this 1992 release of the Yacht-Master could be a great place to kind of look to where this kind of all began. And as mentioned, these earlier Yacht-Master references were certainly trying to find their own footing in the Rolex range, given that it was clearly going to live in the shadow of the Submariner in some aspects, just given its overall design format. And introducing a new product line for Rolex is actually something that's done quite infrequently. The first steps with the Yacht-Masters were to release them in a few different sizes shortly after its initial launch, with the release of a mid-size as well as a 29mm to shortly follow that. But it wasn't really until 1999 when the Rolex Yacht-Master got, in my eyes, its first step forward into more of that unique identity with the reference that we have here today, one that had a solid run throughout the 2000s with the reference 16622. When this model came on the scene, it offered a new approach with its combination of stainless steel and platinum, and at the time of the release of this piece, there was some polarization, much of which remains today, but there was no question when looking at this piece next to, say, a Submariner of the period, the product just seemed a little bit more premium. With its flashier high-polished center link, platinum rotating bezel with raised markers within to be used as a timing bezel, and in addition, perhaps the most notable feature about this Yacht-Master is the incredible platinum dial that really just shimmers in the light. It's just one of those dials that when you see it in certain lighting conditions or say in press photos online, you might think, meh, just another Rolex dial that is lacking a bit in the area of contrast. But when seeing this watch in the flesh, especially in a well-lit environment, you begin to appreciate what this dial offers, and certainly is a point where I think the Yacht-Master really started to become its own with this dial format. As recently, I think the line now represents what Rolex was going for all along as an upscale sports watch that could live above and near the Submariner. But why I think the Yacht-Master is very interesting is because I think it's an entry into this world of sports Rolex the same way as the Milgauss, but when you take this idea that the Yacht-Master was supposed to be this upscale older brother to the Submariner, and then factor in the idea that these are commonly trading between $6,500 and $8,000 in many cases, and up to 12 months ago, you could pretty much find these all day on the lower end of that. They were one of the most accessible Rolex sports pieces. I think all that combines to make this a very intriguing watch to look at. The watch doesn't come without its faults, one being the legibility of the dial. At certain angles, it does kind of struggle there, but probably the leading downside is the clasp. It feels incredibly outdated compared to more modern Rolex watches, but apart from this, it really does maintain a premium aesthetic. It's very wearable in terms of what it's providing, but also does not come with the same premiums typically seen with Rolex watches. And I think all that together makes this another one that's underappreciated and probably should be considered by some people that maybe either want to add to the Rolex collection or just trying to get into it and don't really know where to look and don't want something that's very popular and seen everywhere. All right, guys, so those are two of the more underappreciated Rolex sports models in my mind, currently looking at them in 2020, that I think from a value perspective are one of the only ones that are not demanding crazy premiums in terms of price. And I think outside of maybe the Rolex Explorer 2, which again, probably has recently went up in value. I've seen the prices gradually just continue to go up, as well as looking at, say, the Rolex Air King, for example. Those, I think, are all the watches that I don't necessarily see get the same amount of love. And I think for a lot of people out there, unfortunately, because they're maybe looking for status when looking in the direction of Rolex, aren't gonna look at these watches because I don't think they're necessarily as recognizable. But for somebody that just wants a very good watch, also wants kind of the ability just to feel safe with getting a Rolex and just knowing that you always kind of have your value there, I think they're honestly great watches to look at, and especially if you want to be a little bit different and don't necessarily care about that type of just status element that's commonly associated with the brand. I mean, I love my Explorer 2, and I think these are two other watches that should be packed together in terms of that level of underappreciation. But guys, I'd love to see your thoughts down below. What is your favorite underappreciated Rolex? Do you agree with these picks? What do you think of them? Love to see comments down below. Also, big shout out to Bob's Watches for letting me test drive these pieces. If you are in the market for pre-owned Rolex, definitely check them out. I'll actually have links down below to these pieces if you are interested. Again, definitely go check out those blogs as well on the website. I'll leave links down below. And while you're there, definitely go check out the section of watches and watch straps. And also be sure to follow me on Instagram to stay up to date with the content, as well as see some cool photos of watches. So guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.